You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Lian Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. And the next way you can walk this path is by joining us for the new evolution of Waking the Wild Sovereign, which begins in November. This is our most intimate crucible. Currently, it's the only way to work with us one-to-one, and it is how you can free yourself from conditioning and wounding, discover and express your unique gifts, open your heart, and follow your soul path, becoming the sovereign man or woman you came here to be. It's already filling up with the kings and queens who have heeded the call. If you feel it could be for you too, then go along to primalhappiness.co/WTWS to discover more and to arrange a call to explore it more with one of us. And now onto this week's show. It's with Dr. Paul Leslie. Paul is a psychotherapist, author, and educator in South Carolina. He's authored 8 books, which focus on the areas of transformative psychotherapy, healing, shamanism, and personal development. Paul is a popular trainer of solution-based therapies, Ericksonian hypnosis, and creative coaching applications. In this show, we explore the parallels between magic and psychotherapy, the power of our context for creating the life we live, how and why we make distinctions and how they can be limiting, and how we can move from problem-solving existence to a magical life in which we listen to our own hearts to guide us. I loved this show, absolutely adored it. It was such a fresh take on a way of understanding how we're creating our lives and what's possible for us instead. I think you're going to love this one. Let's dive in. Hello, Paul, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and it's a delight to chat with you today.
Oh, lovely to have you here and to talk about magic, which is definitely one of my favorite topics. And I love your particular lens on this. And I think coming from the background you do, I think it's a particularly refreshing and needed perspective, actually. So I'd just love to know, like, what took you here from, I guess, quite traditional psychotherapy to having this magical lens on things that typically wouldn't be the kind of like modes of treatment one might expect from a psychotherapist.
Yeah. Well, it's been a bit of a journey, as everything that's worth having tends to be. Sometimes our greatest victories also contain our greatest scars. And for me, it's just a whole series of events that happened several years ago, just some basic life changes for me. I was doing what I think most of us tend to want to do when we want to be this idea of successful. We want to have a good career. We want to make a decent income. We want to have a family, big house, nice car, all those things, which are all wonderful. And I encourage anyone who can do that to pursue that if that's their passion. But a few years back, what happened for me was one day, my wife at the time just decided she didn't want to be married to me anymore. And this was very devastating to me, as it is for a lot of people who go through these type of situations. And so I had to kind of reevaluate my life, because in the midst of all this unhappiness that I was going through, this desperation, almost for lack of a better term, traumatic family dissolving, I realized that the things that were most important to me was not the fact that I had an article published in the latest peer-reviewed journal, or that I got to speak at the international conference, or that my latest book was out, or I won top therapist, blah blah blah. What was most important to me was at that time was to keep my family together. And that wasn't meant to be. It ended up being a positive thing in the end for me, because it started me on this journey of trying to figure out what is important in life. And I think a lot of us, particularly as, in my early 50s now, and so it's, hitting the midlife, where are we in this world? But it got me thinking is that I had spent so much time thinking of life in utilitarian terms that I had totally failed to approach it from a context of, I use the term magic, and I don't mean that in the occult sense or the, kind of ritual magic, although those can have, elements of that, but just that there's some sense of wonder and enchantment that wasn't there. No matter what I did, I was unsatisfied. I mean, I'm very proud of my accomplishments, but at that time I was unsatisfied. Yeah, I wrote a book. Guess what? Time to get on the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And guess what? There's the next one, and it became this treadmill. The house is nice, but it could be a bigger house. The career. Okay, I got to move on to a bigger university, or increase my practice 5 times. And I was stuck in this utilitarian. I have to solve a problem. And the problem is I don't have enough, or I don't feel enough, or I'm not enough as a human being. And it totally overshadowed the idea that, there's this thing called enchantment and mystery. And it had totally blindsided me until except when I had this event where I was losing what I thought was the most important thing to me, to say, hey, guess what? You have been living your life pretty much without any degree of enchantment. And it was funny because as it was occurring to me, I happened to one night in my quiet solitude come across a book by the American writer and psychotherapist Thomas More. It's called The Re-Enchantment of Everyday Life, or I think that's the title. And he's, coming from kind of a Jungian perspective, archetypal. But I'm reading that and I'm like, this is exactly what's happening. I have moved so far into, if I can use a very stereotypical description, a left brain perspective of life. And I have totally stopped caring as much about that right brain emotion, that right brain wonder, that right brain creativity. And I realized I was an unbalanced person, emotionally unbalanced, financially unbalanced, in some ways physically unbalanced. And it wasn't until I had to stop and say, okay, what is really driving your life, Paul? And what I found was it was the context. And what I mean by context is that's the kind of, if we had to put a frame around our life, and like it's a picture, and we have to label that frame something. So for some people, their frame is, making a difference. And so everything that happens within the frame is related to making a difference, which I think is a great frame to have. For others, and that was me, it was kind of solve a problem, because life had become a problem. I mean, not like I was always upset at life, but again, if I only have $100,000 in the bank, well, that's a problem, because I need 110,000 or 120,000 or 150 pounds, euros, whatever your audience here is into. So it's like when you have a context for your life that's based on solving a problem, then everything you do within that frame of living is based on solving a problem. And the worst thing is that we become the context. We forget that we're the ones who create the context. And so we become the context. So when I became problem solving, I was pretty good at problem solving. I am like the king of type A personality. Do you want me to work 15 hours a day? I can do it, But I forgot that I was the one who created that whole context that there's a problem in life, It's like the the guy who has the wife, but in the back of his mind, she's great and all, but there could be somebody better. And so he never stands too close to her, never interacts too much with her because he's worried he may have, some perfect supermodel that comes out of the forest, on a white horse, like Lady Godiva, and swoops him away. Because that's a problem-solving existence. It's saying what I have now is a problem, and the problem is it's not enough. And then worse, we become attached to solving problems. And so when we become attached to solving problems when there are no problems, well, since we're creating the context, then we have to create the problems. And so everything now becomes a problem. It's like life is inside the context, inside the frame. And I forgot that life is the frame. And I'm inside the frame thinking it's the other way around. So I've made life a problem as opposed to life just is. And sometimes I got problems, but it's just, not who I am. It's not, the goal of my life now. Certainly, I don't look at it as a purpose to solve problems. I mean, professionally, I'm a therapist, and in some ways, I help people solve problems. But even then, I've changed the way I do therapy. I don't see that a lot of things that people do are really problems. It's not really a problem issue. It's a perception issue in many cases. So,
oh my goodness, yeah.
So it's a lot to unpack there. So
yes. Oh, there's so much that came up as you were talking, and I think I said this just before we started recording, that whilst so many of our listeners are very smart, conscious, magical, creative, sovereign, I think it's so easy to miss what you were talking about there, about that overall context that we're creating and living from, and how that will infuse everything. And I think just having that clarity on, like, what is that context, and have I actually chosen it, or is it something I've kind of adopted from my culture or from my parents, which is typically where people's context is going to come from. And I can really see how, I guess, that default context for a lot of people will be something like you're describing, like a problem solving context or a survival context. And so, yeah, I think that's just so powerful to illuminate in the way you have. So I really, really value that. Something that really stood out to me, and when you talk about Thomas More and that Jungian lineage, for me, that Jung's work is, is infused with magic. I love archetypes. I love, that just the whole that in itself is a context. The whole gold, shadow, like all of that. I think as these kinds of things go, Jung's is incredibly magical. But what I'm really hearing, and as you talk further, I was like seeing, but if you are looking at his work through a problem-solving context, it kind of like, it then loses its magic because you're still looking at it through that context of problem-solving. So I guess two things I'd like to ask you. One, just your thoughts on that. And secondly, how you, I guess, made that shift, which I think is unusual, to seeing how that was true in your own life, to then starting to bring that into the work you were doing with your clients, which I think is quite courageous, really. Again, when you've come from a traditional psychotherapy background, to then kind of go, wow, this is actually what's at play for all the people that I'm working with too.
Right.
So two questions there.
Sure. Yeah. The first question, I'm not a Jungian. That's not my background. I certainly have read a lot of Jung, and his book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which is kind of his biography, I think is a wonderful read for anybody. I don't view Carl Jung as a psychologist, even though he was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor. I view him as a hermeticist.
Yes. Well, I love that. Yes.
Yeah. So if you look at him as a therapeutic hermeticist, everything makes sense then. So you have to go, I'm talking about context, you have to have the context of what hermeticism is, and your audience probably knows more about that than even I do. But for a lot of people, it's hard to understand until you kind of have that background. But certainly, anytime any theory, whether it's something more mystical like Carl Jung, or even something more linear like cognitive behavioral therapy, if you are just so focused on techniques, then you lose the interaction, and then it just becomes this kind of empty template. So there's certainly a lot of interesting things from Jung. Going to your second question, for me, it starts with this idea of making a distinction. Now, years ago, I read this book, which I highly recommend anyone to read. It's a little challenging because it makes you look at the world slightly different, and particularly if you have a math phobia, it's got a troublesome. It's called Law of Forms by George Spencer Brown, who's kind of a mystical mathematician. And what Spencer Brown essentially showed is that every act of creation involves the making of a distinction. You cannot see anything, you cannot experience anything until you make a distinction. So once you make a distinction, you create up a dividing kind of a barrier between one part or the other. So this is so you have an experience. So you have this, and then you can think of a slash or a mark, and then you have not this. So the very act of any creation, and I don't mean this in the, you often hear the kind of the new thought or new age, just like you create your own reality. I won't take it to that extreme to where everything that's ever happened to you created in your mind, but I will say that any act of discernment has to start with a distinction. So when we start to realize that no matter what's happening, we are certainly a part of it, we're observing it, but we are the ones who are making the distinction between this or that. And by just doing that, we've already automatically set up a boundary. Now, sometimes this is very helpful in navigating the world. Like if you're driving, you might want to make a distinction between car and sidewalk, know which one's different there. But in a lot of things, we create this boundary that sometimes holds us back. Somehow we believe that the boundary that we have created, the distinction that we have made, is somehow inherent in the world. And then we feel victimized by the distinction that we've made because we don't realize we've made it. Much like the context comes out of the making of distinctions. So if we say there's a distinction between this and not this, then we will start to live what I call a lopsided existence, because we'll want more of one and not more of another. And so we will start to operate our lives on trying to only be one half of something that you can never be one half of. Now, this is what I try to get across sometimes to clients is, if someone comes in and say, I'm depressed, that's everyone's got reasons for that. Sometimes it's, in some cases, biological, whatever it is. But in order to say you're depressed, you have to have an experience of not being depressed. Otherwise, you can't make that distinction. But here's the problem. If you're trying to do away with depressed, you've forgotten that there's depressed / not depressed. So by trying to eradicate one, you actually further secure that dynamic. And now we are going back to our problem solving way. It's like if I can do more of something or do less of something, then I can eradicate it from my life. And what I started to see is that we spend so much time trying to eradicate negative things about ourselves. And I'm not talking about the minor things. We can always get better with life in general, but just the way we approach life is, we're totally making ourselves crazy by trying not to feel crazy. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I get someone who comes to therapy because they have anxiety. And anxiety is a normal emotional state. It's just a lot of times their attempts to eradicate their anxiety has only made their anxiety worse. And then they start living their life as a way to try to eradicate their anxiety. So they try real hard not to think about things that are tied to the anxiety. Well, to not think about something, we all know that you have to think about that thing to not think about that thing. So now they're in this vicious loop. And so then they maybe stop doing certain things that could lead to the anxiety. But in order to stop doing things that could lead to the anxiety, you have to, of course, be totally connected to the thing, that it's kind of like putting your hand on a wall and pushing the wall and saying, that somehow the wall and you aren't a part of each other when you're connected to the wall anytime you're trying to push on the wall. So this ability to just kind of redistinguish what anxiety means, changing your relationship to anxiety, to depression, to your life. It's not a matter of eradicating things. And unfortunately, most psychotherapy, in my opinion, not all of it, because some of the things I'm saying aren't new. I mean, I found some of this in some forms of family systems therapy, the work of Milton Erickson, really amazing practitioners and people who came up with groundbreaking ideas. But the bulk of therapy, a lot of times, is about to eradicate something. And this idea of, okay, we've got to get rid of your anxiety or get rid of your depression. It sounds wonderful. And it's great if that can happen. Maybe in some cases it can. But the very act of trying to totally get rid of something and cast it out. It's like one of my colleagues wrote an article about how so many therapy is really not that much different from exorcism. Because what you do in an exorcism is you go in and you banish that part out. And it's the demon. You got to get the demon out. Well, if it's the depression, it's the anxiety, it's in the relationship, it's, all these things that life gives us. If we're trying to constantly exercise our life, we're not really living our life. We are caught in that vicious circle of this and not this, hoping somehow that nature and the universe won't have a balance. Well, if we spend any time looking at life or science or anything, you find that ecosystems always have a balance, So why shouldn't we have good days in addition to bad days? But who's making the distinction? Is we are making the distinction. So there's always this homeostatic flow in life, but we are the ones many times that say this shouldn't be, or this is uncomfortable, and so now I have to eradicate it. When the Big Bang happened, theorists say that there's an explosion and there's this mass expansion, but there was also a contraction to allow stabilization for gravity. Well, right there, you have this balance. The foundation of the universe, because if it expanded too much, it'd fall apart. If it contracted too much, it'd fall apart. So our lives are not about so much seeking a balance all the time, but riding these waves of life through a context of realizing that we are the person making the distinction. And if you go to a good therapist, a lot of time a good therapist, all they'll do is to redistinguish, to say, okay, that's one way of looking at it. Here's another way. And sometimes just that alone transforms whatever problem they have. Problem is, what do? Problem is the problem. They move on to the next problem. So it has to be a greater context, as into if my life is about helping others, that's the context. Whatever happens in my life is tied to that context. So if I'm going through a tough time, but the context of my life is helping others, that changes it, as opposed to the context is everyone's trying to screw me over, or the context of, one of these days I'll get a break, or, nobody loves me, or life is hard and then you die, and all these things that we're the ones who are kind of creating.
Yes. Oh, wow. Yes. I so appreciate the clarity with which you've discerned that. It reminded me of a conversation I had with the author William Whitecloud quite recently, and his story is such an amazing illustration of what you've just talked about, in that, in short, he had something like, I think, well over 10 years of extreme ill health, this mystery illness, like horrendous. Are you familiar with William Whitecloud?
I've heard the name.
Yeah. And so he'd had this mystery illness, had gone to kind of like all the top doctors and researchers trying to identify what was wrong with him and cure it. And he got to the point where he was really believing he was going to die. He was so weak, had lost so much weight, and then had this kind of seeming chance conversation with a stranger who said, I know what you've got, because I had the same thing. and gave him this kind of like really strange sounding treatment plan, which was basically, because by this point had taken everything out of his diet and he was sort of existing on vegetable water and not much else. And it was kind of, go and eat this much meat, drink this much wine, smoke these cigarettes. And within days, he started to feel better. And he said, I knew at the time it couldn't really be in those substances, but something had shifted. And he's ended up, he then regained full health and then realized there was something in that shifted that focus and context from not being ill to, I guess, living or moving into health. I don't quite know. I don't think he's even quite understood like what exactly was the shift from and to, but I can see how powerful an example of that is, of exactly what you're saying. It was that seeing like, I need to get away from being ill, just creating more and more illness in his life. And, I see this over and over again in my own life and in the lives of clients. But I think the way you've named that, I think is, exceptionally clear. And again, you're right, it's human to make these distinctions. And yet it's when we create these, I guess, such like rigid and permanent lines between things that isn't sort of shifting according to the moment. And also, as you say, is within an overall limiting context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great example. It's basically changing our relationship to what is, rather than changing what is. And it seems very simple, but so much of our life is based on if I can make what is different, as opposed to, okay, well, how can I change, the way I relate to it? Here's a really simple example, a therapy example. A mother brings an 8-year-old to therapy, and the 8-year-old's being a quote unquote bad boy. So now we already have a context for the session, bad boy. And the reason he's being a bad boy is mom has a new relationship. She has divorced the 8-year-old's father because the 8-year-old's father was physically and emotionally abusive, and she has gotten away from him and now starting a new relationship with a nice man. So the nice man, unfortunately, is getting the wrath of the 8-year-old. He's jealous because, this guy won't spend time with his mother and all these kind of things. And so he's real rude to him. He tries to act, the boy acts out, all of this. So the mom comes and says, I've got this 8-year-old that's a problem. He's a bad boy. And nothing I do tends to keep him from being a bad boy. Well, for me, I said to her, thinking about this whole thing, I said, sounds to me like he's trying to protect you because he saw what happened to you with your husband. And maybe he's trying this guy out, pushing his buttons, trying to see if he's man enough to not be cruel and abusive like the other guy. And he's there to kind of really just protect mom. He's almost like mom's bodyguard. And guess what? Context changed. Everything the kid was doing didn't change, but the context changed. So mom went from seeing bad boy to a new frame of reference, a new context of my protector. So granted, he still had to, when he acted out, he still had to have a consequence, as we have to do with our children, but she wasn't pulling her hair out. And the really funny thing is, once she shifted her relationship to the behavior started to change. I mean, he still did what he was doing, but he started to relax a little bit with the guy. And so it's all this dynamic interplay that a lot of times we don't realize we're the one creating this distinction that's our relationship. So for me, a magical life is to make your life one big magical act. And how you do that is to constantly examine your distinctions, is to constantly examine your context. When someone does a magical spell or ritual, or if they're into those kind of things, it's usually there to accomplish something. I mean, that's generally that. I'm saying to do those kind of things just to do them, rather than to, we have so much of our life is in the phrase, in order to.
Yes.
I'm doing this in order to blah, 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 and sometimes magical existence is just, I feel like doing this and to do it. And Some people do magical spells for healing. Some people do it for income. Some people do it to sell expensive training courses. I don't know. It's all these kind of things. And it's usually some in order to, but I'm thinking if you want to have a magical life, examine your distinctions you're making and maybe just do something different. Look at things a little differently or do something. Why not do rituals instead of trying to get some cryptic ritual out of a book? Just create it on the spot. Because if you're the one creating the distinction, then maybe that ritual that's in the book might not be for you. You ever thought about creating a kitchen ritual? If you love to cook, why not do a kitchen ritual? You can get out your pots and do a certain ceremony there. To me, that's a magical existence. That's a magical life, is that I am only able to live if I'm interacting. And if I have to plan everything I'm going to do, I'm not present. It doesn't mean that we don't have long-term goals, but it's the interactions, like in therapy. It's really the interaction that helps people heal, because researchers have found that all the techniques and theories essentially are all the same. They're all good, but it's that interaction. And a lot of people don't interact with life. They just kind of sit back and observe life. Now, for a lot of people, they hear me say that and they go, well, isn't that the Buddhist thing where you detach? And it's like, well, yeah, but at the same time, you can be detached in a healthy way, but also still interacting. And when we have made the distinction that life is a certain way, our interactions are only going to show up in that way. Yes. So by changing that context, maybe we can have more interactions that are more freeing, less, going back to your comment about social conditioning. I mean, maybe it's someone else's context. Maybe we can interact in a different way that changes that conditioning. Or maybe we like the conditioning, Maybe we have this idea that we're supposed to be so different than we are, but maybe we're not. Maybe we're exactly what we're supposed to be. Maybe that's the magic.
Oh, I love this. I really do. So I remember something you said was around what you kind of almost like you've come to, I guess, differ from the traditional view of psychotherapy that, patients, clients have problems and then you're there to solve them. And you really recognize it's this lack of meaning and magic and wonder that was really at the heart of this, that was kind of expressing in the form of these so-called problems. So I'm guessing that is, if someone comes to work with you, they're not expecting ultimately to be pointed in the direction of more meaning, magic, and wonder. So I'd love to know, how has that changed, I guess, what you do when you're working with people, and also how has that changed the results that you have with people?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I came to the conclusion through a lot of personal experiences, a lot of reading research in neuroscience, and from studying a indigenous culture that is near me and their healing magical ideas, that information really doesn't change people. Experience changes people. So when someone comes in and sits down with me as a therapist, my goal is not always to give information, although that's certainly a component, but it's to create an experience for them in that moment, because it's experience that changes our brain.
Yes. I love that.
Well, that's if you don't have a new experience to override the old experience, it doesn't matter how much you know about it. It's like that old joke about the guy being in psychoanalysis for 10 years. And they said, well, how's it going? He says, well, I don't feel any better, but I understand a whole hell of a lot more. It's like, until we have an experience, we're not going to, a new experience that's as powerful or more powerful, we're just going to keep doing those same kind of things. And that experience differs from client to client. Some people need me to just sit with them and let them talk. And that experience they don't have. So just having somebody who's not judging them and is just quiet and gives them that ability to express how they feel, that's magical to me. Other people might need me to just, in a second, jump up and go, okay, come with me. And then I take them outside and walk around with them and have them do things that are out of the ordinary. Others might need, to be challenged a little bit in a very compassionate and playful and certainly ethical way. So all of this is dependent on the individual I'm working with. And when I got away from the idea that I'm supposed to be doing therapy, and I said, okay, well then I guess I need to be therapy. I need to evoke things because it's this co-creative experience, whether you're doing traditional psychotherapy, coaching, alternative healing work. Yes, you're doing things to the person, but a lot of times we forget that they're also giving back to us. It's a co-creative experience, and healing is a co-creative experience.
Yes.
So whatever they say, my reaction is a reaction to what their reaction is, which is reaction to mine. There's a whole degree of improvisation and spontaneity within this context of being therapy. So I just found that if people have a certain experience, that's what stays with them. Not here's the great ideas that you need to do. I mean, we all have friends and family we know who we've given them the perfect information. I mean, we really do. Here's the perfect information. And they go, oh, okay, thanks. And then they go back and, get back into the engineer seat of the train wreck that they're about to keep doing and over. So to me, it's about creating an experience. Now, what is a magical experience, like I say, is different from every person. Years ago, as I mentioned, I was fortunate. I live in a state called South Carolina, the eastern United States. And on the coast of South Carolina is a culture known as the Gullah. These are people who are the descendants from slaves that were brought over. So what is fascinating about, so many things fascinating about this culture is that they've retained so much of their original African culture mixed with the European culture. They have their own language and own customs and things like that. Well, I got to reading and learning and interacting with them, and I found that they have a system of healing that they'll sometimes call root work. And that's also sometimes called hoodoo in some parts of the country. But what I gathered out of the root work is a lot of the root work they would provide charms, amulets, roots, literal roots from the ground. But there was always, in my experience, some kind of build up to that. How they talked with the person they were giving these things to, the way they talked to them. They instilled, at least the ones I envisioned, a state of wonder and state of enchantment. At the same time, a state of fear too, because they could be a little frightening, some of these figures. But for the ones that I studied that were all about healing, they created this field of interaction, of energy, if you will, that created the experience of healing. And that got me to thinking that indeed what therapy and coaching, all that, these are performance arts. These are, you're creating a performance. But the thing is, it's not a scripted, it is a total improvisational, spontaneous performance. And yes, you can know that you're going to supply this ritual or this root or this psychotherapy technique or this coaching intervention or whatever it is. But how you're creating the experience is as important, if not more important, in helping people change the way they view themselves, the way they view their lives. So I think that's been the biggest shift for me as a therapeutic practitioner. But that also requires me to take total responsibility for myself. I can't rely on a theory or a technique. I have to be authentic in the moment to, be, and it's tricky sometimes to not be afraid to say and do certain things as long as they're ethical, to create those shifts. And it has taught me quite a bit that has kind of over into my life of being more spontaneous, more authentic. But it's a little tricky. A lot of folks don't know kind of what to expect. But my goal is, as far as effectiveness, is to giving them what they need rather than sometimes what they want.
Oh, wow. Yes. So much of what you're saying is just like coming alive in me. It's like, oh, yes, that just makes so much sense. And again, I really love the clarity you're bringing to these things. one of the examples that popped into my mind was about the power of the experience, and in the way that an experience can have a profound effect that feels magical, because it's like we can't quite name, like, how would that have created that? And one example that came into mind, I've just I shared with you earlier, I've just begun Waking the Wild Feminine, a course that I run usually about once a year, and it's primarily based around a circle, so kind of talking stick style, sharing from the heart. And I've just seen over and over that experience of expressing oneself and expressing parts of oneself that perhaps aren't normally expressed, aren't normally welcome, are shut down when they are expressed. Being able to hear oneself speak these things that aren't normally spoken and have them heard and it be okay, that in itself is such a profound experience that changes something. It creates something different. And so that was an example that popped into my mind. But yes, what you've said makes so much sense. It really is all about the experience, and we miss that over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. And just the idea of being free to be who you are. I think that's what a lot of people seek in therapy and in these kind of programs like you run, and just let me be myself. And we have to shed so much, and we don't know whether that's really us or not. And just that place to, if I'm angry, it's okay to be angry. If I'm sad, it's okay to be sad. If I'm frustrated, all those kind of things. That to me is one of the most healing things that you can do. There's a big importance too that that the person that you're working with has your best interest at heart. This idea that we're not judgmental it's a nice phrase, but we all are judgmental. I mean, we're ever not. But to where
goes back to the distinctions, doesn't it? Really?
Exactly. But we're not getting that judgment in the way of impeding another person in being who they are. And going back to the idea of a magical life is really taking the time to question the things about yourself. You may have noticed this in any our desire. Our brain is a social organ. We're designed, even introverts. I'm an introvert, and I kind of like my downtime away from everybody. But we still need that interaction with other people. But we find a lot of times, if we don't know ourselves, it's real easy for us to move into certain groups and to take on the group identity, whether it's it's the family as the group, certain organizations, certain political affiliations, and all of that. And if we aren't careful, it's real easy to mistake someone else's context for our own. And then when we become that, any questioning of the group, any consideration of that it can lead to a lot of people being upset or hurt. I mean, you see now how many people are you can't say certain things in political context. And I'm not saying that we let people do whatever, but the amount of fear and anger and reactivity of any group. I'm not making distinctions between political parties or anything. It's because there's something in there that we have wrapped so much of our identity around that when it gets kind of poked, we start to react like it's like you're calling my mom a bad name and then you want to punch somebody in the mouth. And I think part of that is just stepping back and why am I dressing this way? That's always a good thing. Why am I dressing this way? Is it because it's comfortable? Is it for work? What do I do with my hair this way? Is it because I like it, or am I trying to look like someone else? And starting in those kind of things, and then slowly working our way out, we may find that we don't change much. And hey, I'm this way because I actually like to be this way, and that's fine. That's fine. But so many of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, a lot of this has been handed to us, and we don't realize it. So for me, that's an important part to go, okay, am I really the one who's designing and running my life? Or is this an old, Werner Erhard used to say racket? People run rackets all the time and they don't realize they're running a racket. And unfortunately, the racket ends up running them.
What a brilliant quote to end on.
Mhm.
Really, really wonderful. Thank you so much. We're just out of time.
Sure.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. There's so much here again that you've got really wonderful way of illuminating things with a level of clarity I think is unusual. And so I've taken lots from this conversation. Where
Okay.
can listeners find out more about you and your work, which I'm sure they'd like to do?
Yeah. Well, easiest place is just to go to my website, which is Dr. Paul Leslie. That's a DrPaulLeslie.com. And that has a link to my online courses, my books, consulting work. I do consulting with therapists and coaches and healers and those kind of things. That's the best place to find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Again, this has been a real pleasure. And yeah, I always enjoy speaking about magic, but I think your particular context
Mhm.
perspective on this is really refreshing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I was honored to be here.
Ah, what a wonderful show. Here are my takeaways. What is your context? This is a filter through which you will see everything and create within. Paul talked about the way we make distinctions. This is a natural and unavoidable thing. The invitation is to notice when our distinction has become a problem or a limitation that is creating a life that isn't the one we desire. I love how Paul talked about experience versus information. Of course, this is especially relevant for coaches and therapists and change workers, but is actually so helpful for all of us who wish to create a life of wonder and meaning. If you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 338. And if you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, we have got, by the way, some amazing episodes in the vault. The team have been just creating such gold in terms of the guests coming to the show at the moment. So, yes, you really don't want to miss out. Head on over to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or your app of choice and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll get an episode delivered straight to your device as soon as it comes out. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.